This is my presentation on my Capstone study evaluating the effect of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 on eviction rates and housing quality for rent-stabilized tenants in Brooklyn, New York. So for some background on evictions, an estimated 1 in 40 renting Americans are evicted annually, a higher rate in larger U.S. cities like New York. Eviction has been linked to harmful health outcomes, including birth complications and premature mortality. And studies have shown that eviction is largely due to unaffordability, with an estimated 86% of eviction cases in New York City Housing Court being categorized as non-payment filings or inability to afford rent. Rent stabilization was employed by the state of New York in order to provide more affordable housing, with an estimated 1 million of the 2.3 million rental units in New York City being rent stabilized units. Rent stabilized units, unlike market rate, are capped at the rent amounts that the rent can be increased each year. And as an example of comparison, actually, from 2019 to 2022, rent stabilized units were capped at a total 3% maximum increase over that time frame, whereas market rate units saw a 12% median gross rent increase within the same 3-year time span. With rent regulation, the state of New York for a long time was under this umbrella, basically called like vacancy decontrol, which allowed landlords a lot of influence on what they could do whenever there was a vacancy in their units, including terminology called vacancy bonus, where they could increase their rent stabilized unit up to 20% anytime there was a vacancy, then creating a financial incentive for rent stabilized landlords to churn through tenants and find cause for eviction or maintain poorer qualities for their units to incentivize their tenants to leave if they had the means. The Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act was passed in 2019 at the state level in New York, and it included many pro-tenant reforms, particularly for rent-stabilized tenants, including ending the policy of vacancy decontrol and the act of vacancy bonuses. It was also passed in part to reduce the eviction rate for rent-stabilized tenants. This was an act that was largely celebrated, but there was some criticism from landlord interest groups who said that without vacancy bonuses, landlords wouldn't be able to afford to keep up housing standards for rent stabilized units, which would lead to poorer housing quality. The objective of this study was to measure the effect of HSTPA on evictions and housing quality for rent stabilized tenants in Brooklyn, New York. For our methods, we collected our data and aggregated it at the apartment complex level and categorized these apartment complexes into 3 groups based on their concentration of rent stabilized units. With minimally rent stabilized apartment complexes having 0 to 25% rent stabilized units, moderately having 26 to 75, and primarily having 76 to 100%. For our data sources, we sourced our apartment complex rent stabilized unit count from the NYCDB GitHub platform, which scraped the New York City Department of Finance tax bills. And then we collected our other data from the City of New York Open Access Data Platform, which included data sets that had apartment complex characteristics, a data set of executed evictions dating as far back as 2017, and a data set of housing complaints that included whenever there was no heat, rodents. These are just like examples of the sort of housing complaints that would come from tenants to the City of New York in order to audit and enforce better standards. Now, these housing complaints were used as our metric for measuring housing quality, where the higher the number of complaints, the lower the housing quality. For our data sets, we merge them all together based on the property-specific 10-digit building block lot or BBL code that's unique to each apartment complex. And our inclusion criteria included just properties within the borough of Brooklyn with records of evictions or complaints from September 2018 to March 2020. For our analyses, we conducted bivariate, crude linear regression, and difference in differences analyses measuring the effect of HSTPA on evictions and complaint rates by our rent stabilization categories. And our results on table 3 to the right, you can see there are executed evictions presented negligible statistically significant results for HSTPA or our rent stabilization categories, and what were significant had minimal effect sizes. But more importantly, to our left, for our table on housing complaints, for our crude linear regression, the enactment of HSTPA was associated with a decrease of 4.05 complaints on average across all apartment complex categories. And for our DID analysis, when controlling for HSTPA, total number of residential units, and the age of the apartment complex, as well as our interaction terms, moderately and primarily rent stabilization had an average increase of 7.53 and 12.90 respectively complaints compared to minimally rent stabilized apartments, both increases from the crude model output. So in conclusion, from our DID analyses, HSTPA did not have a statistically significant effect on evictions nor housing complaints across our rent stabilized categories. However, housing complaints in moderately and primarily rent stabilized apartment complexes were notably higher than their minimally rent stabilized complex counterparts. These findings are supported by previous studies that have noted housing quality disparities in rent-regulated units, mostly due to limited financial incentive for rent-stabilized landlords to maintain housing quality, as well as inadequate enforcement of standardized housing maintenance, for example, from government agencies like the New York State Tenant Protections Unit, which is under-resourced and understaffed in order to adequately audit and enforce the millions of rent-stabilized units across the state, thus leading the burden of enforcement of like housing standards on to the tenant themselves, which is a pretty significant power imbalance since they would be reporting on the people that basically own the roofs over their heads. They'd be worried about retaliation. So there were some limitations on this study, including using evictions executed as our metric for eviction, which evictions landlords can threaten eviction far, far in advance of whenever there's they even file an eviction itself. And evictions are executed like pretty rarely. We didn't have many examples of those. Also, future studies should consider a wider date range while still being like mindful of the impact of the eviction moratorium and the COVID pandemic and lockdown in New York City shortly after our end date. Nevertheless, this was a novel approach to using DID at the BBL level to analyze the effectiveness of HSTPA. And future policymaking should focus on improving rent-stabilized housing conditions and the enforcement of housing standards for stable housing so that it does not cause harm to rent-stabilized units to live in, or tenants to live in the spaces they can afford. These are my acknowledgements, and thank you very much.